back. This is Boomer Life on CL 650.
I fought for law and a law won. I fought for law and a law won.
Hey, and welcome to The Law Show on CL 650. We're talking about accident victims, families, the stressful process of going through all of that, and why you need to bring in a law firm that can represent you and take ICBC on. And we could change the song to I Fought ICBC and the Law Won. We have in studio with us Kevin Hyde, partner at McQuarrieHunterLLP, and Neil Mulholland, associate counsel. So welcome back to the next segment. We're going to talk about specifically what is in your insurance policy that people aren't aware of. Two of them would be UMP and Part 7 benefits. Now, to the average person listening, that's just going right over their head. I know about this because I've hosted this show in the past, and because I found out about it, I actually upped my UMP. So explain what UMP is and what standard coverage we have in the province with your ICBC coverage and what you can opt for additional coverage.
Sure.
So who wants to take on? What is UMP? We should actually say what the real name is.
UMP is Underinsured Motorist Protection.
Mm-hmm.
And the best way to understand UMP is to understand how liability insurance works in the first place. If you are hit from behind by another driver, the other driver's insurance is what is going to cover that claim.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, ICBC you may think of as your insurance company because they happen to sell you your policy once a year.
They sell pretty much everybody their insurance.
Exactly. But if you were to be rear-ended by a vehicle with Washington plates or Alberta plates, for example, you're not going to be dealing with ICBC for most of that claim. You're going to be dealing with whatever private insurance company happens to cover that vehicle.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So the first thing to understand is the insurance company, the insurance policy that's at play is the other driver's policy. And so you're at the mercy of whatever the other driver decided to buy.
And if it's American driving here in Vancouver, for example, when you see those ads on TV for set your own price with Flow or
Mm-hmm.
whatever those ads are, the Geico, is the reason that you can set your own price is you can set how much coverage you want to have. And in the United States, it can be very low, right?
In Washington, I believe the minimum is $25,000.
That's crazy.
Whereas in BC, it's $200,000.
Right.
Now, just so your listeners are aware, when a Washington driver crosses the border, they are covered by this sort of a rather complicated set of international agreements, but their policy automatically scoops up to $200,000.
Oh.
So if you're hit by a Washington driver in BC, he's got $200,000 minimum coverage.
So you're basically the minimum of the jurisdiction that you're hit in. Is that kind of how it works?
In a strange sense, yes.
Okay.
There's a bit more to it than that, but that's probably sufficient for these purposes. Now, what happens if you are catastrophically injured by somebody who has only the minimum coverage? Because the other thing to keep in mind is that the amount of coverage is not per person, it's per incident. So if you're one of 3 people injured in an accident by somebody with minimum coverage on their vehicle, then you and the other 2 folks have to share that pot of money.
And it's $200,000.
It's $200,000 or maybe $500,000. The point is that if your claim exceeds that amount by a significant portion, the only recourse you have is against the underinsured motorist protection. That's what covers you when the person who is responsible for injuring you doesn't have enough insurance.
They're underinsured. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's the first thing to understand. Now, UMP has recently undergone some changes, and I would urge people to speak to their local auto plan broker for the details on how it works. But basically, everybody has $1 million of underinsured motorist protection that essentially comes with your driver's license. And it applies to anybody within the same household as somebody who owns a BC driver's license.
Mm-hmm.
It also applies to anybody who's involved in a collision with a BC registered vehicle. So if you're a pedestrian or a cyclist who's hit by a vehicle with BC plates, you have that entitlement to UMP. Now, the difficult part about UMP is that what it does is it doesn't add $1 million of coverage to what already exists in the wrongdoer's vehicle. It tops you up to a total of $1 million from all sources, including, for example, any employment insurance benefits you might be entitled to, or any private disability insurance you might be entitled to, or in some cases, CPP disability benefits or that sort of thing. So all of those amounts are deducted from that $1 million. Now, UMP coverage is a highly technical and somewhat Byzantine set of regulations that, frankly, even a lot of experienced personal injury lawyers are somewhat in the dark about. And I've had a couple of cases over the last 10, 12 years or so where UMP coverage has been a major part of the claim. Now, in one case, the accident actually took place in Washington State. My client was hit by what turned out to be a stolen vehicle. Mm-hmm. So there's actually no insurance on that vehicle whatsoever. And so what ended up happening there was that ICBC's uninsured motorist protection covered the first $200,000, and then the balance of the claim was under the underinsured motorist protection. And there are a couple of unique features to UMP, one of which is that the claim cannot be taken to court. In other words, if you cannot agree with ICBC as to what you're entitled to under that UMP protection, you are required to go through a binding arbitration process. Now, the principles that apply to the measurement of your damages are generally the same as they would be in a court case, but the process is often rather different and generally not as expensive or as time-consuming in most cases. What ends up happening is that if a claim clearly exceeds the amount of the available insurance money on the wrongdoer's vehicle, then you make the formal application for UMP protection, which is we generally do in our initial letter to ICBC when we let them know that we are representing somebody. And
just to cover you don't know what the other person has.
Exactly.
Right.
And you often don't learn that until you're well into the claim.
We always do that.
Right.
And that's something that you wouldn't know to do if you didn't have a lawyer that practices personal injury, right?
Now, sometimes it's fairly obvious that it's going to be an underinsured claim. Somebody is hit by a vehicle that is old, beat up, and
has a minimal insurance.
Exactly, and it's not surprising that such a vehicle would have minimal insurance. But sometimes it gets even trickier than that, because let's say the vehicle is part of a fleet owned by a corporation, a business that's a going concern. And in those cases, the vehicle owner, the company that owns that fleet, may only have minimal insurance policies on each vehicle, typically $1 million each. But then they have a general excess liability policy. And this would typically apply, for example, to public transit systems. Each bus may only have $1 million policy on it, but
they have an umbrella policy.
Exactly. And in that case, you don't have recourse to UMP because everything else is deductible from that UMP limit of $1 million. Now, one of the other factors that was mentioned earlier is that you can buy additional UMP coverage. And you can now buy up to $5 million. This is, again, a very recent change in the regulations.
Because I just had mine in January, and they said I could get $2 million, and that was it.
That's changed since then.
It's only an extra $30 or so to do that, so it's really a no-brainer.
It's one of the best bargains in the insurance business. Because
I think it was $30 or $35 to go to $2 million, so now you can get a $5.
Because if you end up catastrophically injured by somebody who has, say, minimal coverage on their vehicle, and let's say you're a person earning $150,000 a year and you're in your mid-30s and you'll never work again.
Oh, I understand also this covers you when you're in the United States and even if you're out of your vehicle. So you're in New York City and you walk out onto the street and you get hit by a cab, that will cover you or a family member. Is that true?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is good basic insurance to have, not only for in British Columbia, but for anybody who travels, because as we mentioned, a lot of drivers in the U.S. are carrying much lower levels of coverage, right?
Yeah.
Are there any stats for what the average ICBC liability coverage is? What do most people opt for? Do you know that?
I don't off the top of my head. I'm aware that most people opt for more than the minimal
basic
coverage, but I'm sure there's statistics out there from the Insurance Bureau, for example, that might be able to shed light on that. Most auto plan brokers will tend to recommend strongly against taking out the minimum coverage.
Yeah. Well, I've always been to their credit, the auto plan agents say, listen, it's like X number of dollars more to get $5 million coverage.
Exactly.
Now, I'm in a position where I can afford it. If you're really on the bubble on the cost, then you're not going to pay it.
Well, the mentality of people is, it will never happen to me.
Yeah.
Well, in our line of work, we see those people that it happens to. And I know Neil was working on a case recently where luckily someone in the household other than the person who was involved in the accident got the excess coverage. And, we're going to use almost every cent of that. So thank goodness for that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's unfortunate, but an awful lot of people look at their ICBC coverage as simply an expensive sticker that goes on the back of their license plate.
Because it's, for most people, that's what it is. Yeah,
exactly. They, like Kevin said, they tend to assume that I will never have to use this. But
or it's for a fender bender or a windshield claim, something like that.
Exactly.
But it's when you really need it.
Or they'll think to themselves, well, the car's not worth much. Why should I have an awful lot of insurance on it? Well, you're not insuring your car per se. You're insuring yourself for liability.
Now,
your family.
Now, what about household insurance? Because I just went through the process because I've hosted this show about, what kind of liability does it ever cross over to automobiles? Do you know that? Because the maximum I could get on my home was also $2 million for liability. Say a tradesperson is injured on my property or what have you, or a kid jumping on the trampoline gets injured and they have to go after insurance. Can that ever slide over to automobiles? Most
household policies expressly exclude any damages that relate to use or operation of a motor vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
I understand there are some exceptions, and for example, you can buy what's sometimes referred to as excess liability insurance, which can cover you for any claims that exceed your auto insurance coverage or your home insurance coverage. That's sort of an umbrella policy. Some people have that kind of coverage, but homeowners insurance applies to a lot more than just your property. It applies to you in general. So if you're skiing at Whistler, you wipe out and you unfortunately hit somebody in the head and they end up with a significant brain injury, your homeowners insurance will cover you for liability there as well. But it expressly does not cover you for anything connected to the use of an automobile.
All right. I just want to take a quick break because we touched on the underinsured motorist protection. I stumbled on the M there, which is I strongly, I just went through this in January getting this, and you only need to have it on one policy. If you have two cars, you only need it on one, right?
That has changed, though, since January.
Oh,
so that's,
okay.
That's where you'll need to speak to an auto plan broker about the fine details. Up until very recently, it was anybody in the household of a BC driver's license holder was covered. But things are now different, and that's...
So if you had bought that policy, then you would still have that coverage.
Exactly.
For that year that you have that insurance.
Right.
You're okay.
I'm okay. Good. Thanks. All right. When we come back, we're going to get into part 7. What is part 7? We'll find that out next on The Law Show.
Celebrating the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CL 650.